nothing seems freer or more natural than color. Look around us. We're all wearing it. It's everywhere, right? Except that what I want to propose to you today is that actually color is a remarkably modern invention, at least color as we know it. For most of human history, color would have been remarkably local. People in an era before planes, trains, and automobiles would have only had access to their local regions. Color also would have been highly seasonal, and it would have had material constraints, meaning that you might see the blue of the sky, but you wouldn't have access to minerals or plants that would give you a way to put that into clothing or paint. If you grew up in 17th century Wales, this would have been your color world. This would have been your palette. Whereas if you grew up in 17th century Utah, this would have been what you were more accustomed to. So color functioned under a set of geographical and natural constraints for most of human history. But let's say that you were lucky and you were able to obtain pigments through trade. They were extremely expensive. So let's take the example of the Virgin Mary in medieval painting, for instance. If you think of Virgin Mary, what color does she typically wear? Blue, right, that's what everyone says. Except that for the early Middle Ages, it was actually more common for Mary to appear wearing red. And that's because Mary was actually being clothed in what was the most expensive color. Red was created from tiny parasitic scale insects that exude carbonic acid when you crush them, and it took 70,000 of these little insects to make 1 pound of dye. So when people were painting Mary in red, it wasn't because they thought of her as fiery or passionate or what other symbols we have for red. It was actually because it was the most expensive color. It wasn't until the 13th century, when ultramarine was imported into Italy from Afghanistan for the first time, that Mary began to be depicted in her traditional blue. And it took another 300 years into the 16th century for Pope Pius V to standardize the liturgical colors of the Catholic Church so that Mary was always clothed in this celestial, pure color. So sometimes economics had more bearing than color symbolism on the colors that people used. But let's say money was no object. You could afford all of the bright colors that you wanted. And actually, I have one more example of an expensive color, which is Tyrian purple. Tyrian purple comes from the murex sea snail, and it took 12,000 of these snails to create 1.4 grams of dye, which would have been enough just to hem a garment. So these are extremely labor-intensive to produce, and that's why they were so expensive. But if you could afford all the Tyrian purple you wanted, that doesn't mean that you necessarily had the right to buy it or could even have access to it. And that's because of the existence of something called sumptuary laws. These laws restricted what people could wear or buy based on their social status. So here you have an image of King Louis XIV, the King of France. He's posed like this because he was a ballet dancer and he was extremely proud of his calves. He's very prominent here, but I don't want you to focus on his glorious gams so much as his shoes. In 1673, Louis made a sumptuary law restricting the wearing of red heels to only the highest nobles. And if you violated this law, there were severe penalties. Some sumptuary laws actually even came with death penalties. What this did was that it made social hierarchies extremely visible. You could look at a person, see what color they were wearing, and immediately know how wealthy they are, where they were born in the social hierarchy, whether they were noble. It was all written into this kind of color world. So what changed? What made it so that we could all wear these glorious red heels if we really wanted to? What democratized things? Well, one of the biggest things that changed was technology. And in 1856, an 18-year-old chemist named William Henry Perkin created a dark purple sludge, but instead of tossing it out, he decided that he would market it and turn it into the color mauve. And this was a hyper bright color, a durable color, and most importantly, a cheap color. And other chemists suddenly jumped on the boat, and within a matter of months, there were hundreds of new color variations. Patent law in this era is really booming with color, actually, in the 1850s and 60s. And this suddenly revolutionized the way people experience color. Color was suddenly everywhere, and it was extremely exciting. People could now afford colors that they never could have dreamed of before. Except that, these colors may not seem all that bright to us. If you look at them, these plates come from the 1850s and 60s. But first of all, we're accustomed to seeing these kinds of colors. But for someone living in that era, they had never seen that amount of that color and seen it that prominently and that frequently. It had only been something for the rich and wealthy. But suddenly it's everywhere. And people start complaining about eye strain. Men are complaining that there are too many women in parks wearing these gaudy dresses and it's ruining their nice afternoon. There were people arguing that it was going to cause nervous disorders because modernity was too stimulating. There were also claims that it could cause political anarchy, which might seem kind of strange until you think back to Louis XIV and realize, actually, there was a visual social hierarchy of color, and now a countess and a factory worker could both wear the same color. So it actually was pretty destabilizing. I mean, the closest that I can think of for how jarring this might be for us is if next week we all decided to wear iridescent colors. And I think it actually would be a little bit disconcerting for people. So what people started to do in response to this new chaotic color environment was to try to create order, to try to impose some kind of regimen on color. And this is actually the period where you start seeing a lot of the color systems we're very familiar with. So the idea of primary, secondary, tertiary, complementary, contrasting, warm, cool colors, all that fun art theory stuff, that actually emerged in this moment when people are very concerned about how colors function and how they should be used. The other thing that happens is that a new set of rules starts developing that are more informal. Rules about the clothes that people should or shouldn't wear at particular occasions, and what is refined. And these took on the language of taste. So in the absence of sumptuary laws, suddenly you could use the idea of taste, look at someone, and in a second gauge whether they were respectable or not. And one of the big shifts that happens is that tasteful colors are considered what they called quiet colors, which meant that you wore more muted colors. You didn't wear those gaudy jewel tones or reds, and it was meant to mirror your kind of internal state. One of the discourses that comes out of this idea of quiet colors is that, of course, the lower classes, who are still super happy that they can finally afford red and blue and purple, they're looked down upon because they suddenly are so coarse. They need this massive amount of sensory stimulation to experience pleasure. And colors begin to be called distasteful if they're too loud, if they are not refined enough. The other thing that happens with quiet colors is that it takes on a racial cast. So people who enjoy bright colors are typically labeled with savage or uncivilized, which began to be applied in colonial territories like India or Southeast Asia or Africa. And this kind of rhetoric of taste and quiet color ultimately gave license to the supposed superiority of white European culture. So color in this way became a weapon. And of course, this is actually pretty ironic because those colors were what were prized by the rich and wealthy. It was only once they were commercialized and available en masse that people began to look at them in a negative light. So these cultural perceptions had many significant social effects, but I want to focus more directly on two of them today. So the first is that this new kind of idea of color and this precision with color actually cemented race as a visual construct. So if you were alive in the Middle Ages, you generally wouldn't have referred to a person by their skin color. It would have been weird to call someone white or black. And that's because if you were referring to someone's appearance, you would typically refer more to their complexion, which was the relationship of fluids inside their body. So if you have too much blood, you might have a red complexion. If you called someone white, it meant they were full of phlegm. Not exactly a compliment. One of the things that changes as colonialism spreads and as slavery grows is that those kinds of discourses start to change, and that's a very long development I don't have time for here. But let's fast forward to the 19th century when you suddenly have all of these very specific, scientific, precise color systems. One of the ways they become implemented is in the development of new skin measurement color taxonomies, like the one that you see here by the German anthropologist Felix von Luschen. This is from the 1880s, the glass one. And these are used for anthropology, dermatology, early forensics, they become used, and then also more nefariously in the early eugenics movement. So one of the things that you see down here in the corner is a top that was invented by the board game maker Milton Bradley in 1895, and it was designed to teach children about color mixing. If you put a red disc and a blue disc on the top and you spun it, you could learn that purple is the resulting color. But in the early 20th century, the American eugenicist Charles B. Davenport put a red, yellow, black, and white disc on the top, and he gathered thousands of subjects, and he spun the top next to their arms and tried to measure what proportion of those colors were in their skin. And the reason he did this was supposedly to gather data to support his claim that people with lighter skin were more morally and intellectually superior. And the reason I bring this up is to say that quite often we think of color systems. If I said the word color system, you would think of it in a neutral sense. It doesn't seem to carry a lot of political meaning. But actually, in an era where color was starting to gain scientific traction, these systems were being developed en masse, it actually led to new forms of colorism and racism, and it actually helped support them. One other area where color had a significant toll was in the realm of public health. So all of these hyper bright colors are suddenly everywhere for the first time, and that's really exciting, and people are buying them, and they're everywhere. They're in homes, they're on clothing, except that many of those were made with chemicals that were actually toxic. So arsenic was very prevalent in these new colors, lead as well, other toxic substances. And throughout the 19th century, people were actually dying because they wanted to wear beautiful colors. So you see here a satirical plate about a man and a woman who are wearing their finest arsenical colored gowns at a ball, and it's actually as they sweat activating the arsenic and slowly poisoning them and killing them. Women were chastised, of course, for their vanity in wanting to wear these colors, but men also fell victim. Unfortunately, children were some of the most prominent victims. There was a whole spate of children dying because they were eating arsenic-colored candies or putting toys in their mouths that were colored or painted with arsenical pigments. And it wasn't just consumers that were affected, because this was the middle of the Industrial Revolution. So the scale of production was also growing. What you see here on the other side, this pretty nasty plate, is the hands of a 13 or 14-year-old girl who was employed making artificial flowers. Her job was to wrap the stems, the wire stems, with arsenical paper that was dyed green. And this was a common job, and many, many teenagers and children actually died producing these colorful objects or inhaling arsenical dust. There are countless stories. There are also many stories of even larger scale devastation, early industrialism. So color manufacturers in France actually were sued on multiple occasions for poisoning the water supplies and soil of entire communities. So one of the things that you see here is that this desire for pleasure and consumerism actually also had very real bodily and public health effects. And you can already see the seeds of questions that we're still dealing with environmentalism and industrialism as it relates to consumer society today. So all of this goes to say that we live in a much more colorful time thanks to the 19th century. But we also have a fundamentally different relationship to color than people would have in the pre-modern era. So for instance, I can have a car in whatever color I want. I could pick neon orange, but I don't drive a neon orange car. And there are a couple of reasons. One is the power of social norms, and they're very forceful. And two is that, frankly, I don't think it's all that remarkable to be able to have an orange car. Most of us just think of color as one more option in a whole sea of customizable options. But if you stop and think about the fact that every dye, tint, shade, everything that we're wearing today, someone had to figure out how to create that color. They had to figure out how to harness a wavelength of light and turn it into a material substance. And that's actually pretty miraculous. And I feel really lucky that there are always going to be color technologies that give us wonder. But if I look forward and think about where I want color to be in 10 years, I'm not really thinking about the technology. I'm thinking about our attitude towards color. Ever since the 19th century invented the idea that quiet color was somehow more refined, more superior, a lot of cultures have implicitly or subconsciously adopted this standard. I mean, just think when you watch TV and we're told to decorate our homes in a neutral palette. I mean, think of the resale value. If you tiled your kitchen in purple, it's probably not a good idea. Or think of clothing. It's okay to have a pop of color in your clothing, but if a man walked into a business meeting wearing all hot pink, I don't think people would think he was that professional. So what I really want in the next 10 years, or I would love to see, is a society that embraces color rather than restraining it. And I don't mean that we all have to walk around wearing neon or hot pink, because after all, quiet colors are colors too. But what I do want is for us to stop just blindly buying into the kinds of assumptions that we make about quiet colors or about colors in general, and stop worrying so much about what people are going to say if we want a loud, garish kitchen or car, and try to re-grasp some of that magic that it must have felt like when those first synthetic colors hit the scene. I want us to stop thinking about norms, because frankly, norms can change. And there is nothing inherently professional or respectable about a particular color. And really, when we think about those categories that we've applied, those categories to color, they come with a lot of economic and social and historical baggage. So it's time for us to revisit those assumptions, to loosen the reins, and to recognize just how powerful and rare and special and meaningful color can actually be. Thank you.